Well, I'd like to welcome you all to Bombo and to our concluding and culminating dialogue in the Inter-Contemplative Dialogue series that we've been running this week. One of the wonderful discoveries that we make in the practice of meditation over time is, as John Main reminds us, meditation creates community. It reveals community. But also, we also know that community is necessary for perseverance and sustainability in our journey of meditation. So meditation creates the means by which it can be continued. And this helps us to understand why we can say to each other, I keep you in my heart, and why, as we face the suffering around us in the world today, we can truly hold that in our heart. It isn't a pious or an empty statement, it's a real statement. And it would lead to a change of mind as well, and therefore to a change of behavior, a change of public policy. 2 million people die every year through conditions related directly to bad water. 500,000 people die from malaria. 700,000 died, I think, 2 years ago from AIDS-related illnesses. And in fact, all of these are avoidable. All of these particular deaths could have been avoided because most of them occurred in the third world, in the developing nations. And we're intensely conscious here in the Western world, in the developed world, of the crisis that we're going through, and that is real suffering and real crisis, and we have to respond with deep compassion. But it's also, I think, going to lead us to a change of mind, to a sense of what it means to hold each other in our hearts. And that has to be translated into not only spiritual practice, not only meditative practice, but into political, economic, and educational, social practice as well. It has to be a practical outcome. So that's what we also hold that in our heart. And that comes about through our sharing, through our intelligence, through our discussion, through our changing our ways of thinking and challenging each other to think differently and to hold our leaders to account. So today's discussion, I think, is very much an outgrowth of that contemplative experience that we've been sharing theologically and philosophically and psychologically, and also spiritually in our meditation practice during these last few sessions. And so we dedicate this session to the way in which we will be able to contribute as a contemplative community made up of people of different beliefs, but sharing the same faith and humanity. We will be able to contribute to the recovery and to the changing of the world, the conversion of the world after this epidemic has been controlled. So hand over to Leo now, who's going to guide us and direct the questions.
Thank you. So thank you everyone that sent questions. Now we did, of course, we did a selection, and so we will start. I try to group them in similar topics. So I'm going to in the beginning to share the screen so it make it easier to everybody to understand the questions. We start with 2 questions that I thought were related. So the first one is, how are contemplation, meditation, silence, stillness, awareness, etc. able to reach out and help those who are suffering in the world, families, friends, co-workers, a whole nation, an entire universe, and be source of healing? The next one, what insights have come into your awareness with the current pandemic? So this is for all panelists.
Eva, maybe would you like to start?
I can say, especially from the experience of solitary retreat for months on end, this becomes an extremely important question for me. And I don't know that I've come to any final answers, but certainly I'm honored to share any insights. I often find that the more withdrawn I can be in retreat, sometimes the deeper the resonance, as you just said, Father Laurence, about actually feeling that I am holding many, many people in my heart, both those who I have names and faces and associations of friends and people I've met or seen in life, and those I've only heard about or can imagine and extrapolate. And so it has shown me gradually in different stages, different ways, how true that is, that the deeper we can go inside, sometimes the more authentically we can feel connected to the totality of life, sentient beings, as well as the environment on this planet, and then extended, looking out at the stars, looking into the sky and imagining what is the scope of life in our universe or many universes. But then to connect it to so many of the themes this week, and even what I was saying on Thursday, when we take refuge in the ground of awareness, which for each one of us, there's a way of saying it dwells within our hearts. And I think we'll speak about this more later, but obviously not as in a physical heart, not as in an organ, but as in that core of our spiritual being. The more I think we tap into that ground awareness, which, as Alan has been speaking, is not one or many, is not individuated in the way that we think of it as individuated beings, but rather is the ground of all of us, then it becomes very real to see that the awareness arising within me is of the same nature as the awareness arising within every other living being. And there's a perspective from which that is completely one, and space, time are of no object, just not an issue. And so many visualizations where one's sending light or receiving light, this is just a way of conceiving, imagining for ourselves the connectedness. But the connectedness is much more fundamental than any spatial representation. And so in Christian terms, to speak of the Christ who is at the center of all things, the oneness of which he speaks, especially in the Gospel of John, in the last discourses, the perspective from which he can look in every person's eyes and know that they are not separate from him. I think the more that we can try to dwell in our meditation, in Christ's prayer, as we've been speaking of, then it's not us. It's not as if I have to do something that will somehow help others. It's not as if the fact I'm praying is somehow a direct efficacy in the way that we can see outer efficacy of a physician helping a patient, but rather it's a bearing witness, a dwelling within the one universal prayer of Christ, or from a Buddhist perspective, the Gomba, the enlightened view, the enlightened perspective of all beings that is being manifested in works in our world. So it's not easy to see this sometimes, but I find that the more we have the courage to dwell in it, the more we see its efficacy.
Laurence, we have many questions to address today, and I'd love that we can touch on all of them. So I will keep my response very brief, so that it's more in the mode of a dialogue and with our community here. You mentioned a couple of days ago that in 24 hours, 100,000 people, I think you said, 500,000, 500,000, wasn't it? 500,000 signed up to put themselves in harm's way, as volunteers going out to help people. And that just really touched my heart to see such an outpouring, as I've been emphasizing so much going inwards. And so there's something here that I've called the sacred tension, two noble aspirations. One, to go out. Let us go out and be of practical service in any way we can, in any way the Spirit moves us. The exhalation, not just going out in the pursuit of happiness, going out in cultivation of being of service, but then at the same time coming in. And so in Buddhism, we have two modes of prayer, one could say, one in the Theravada tradition, but then is ubiquitous. And that is in times of crisis, like the tsunami that struck many years ago, people gathering, communities gathering, and just sending out our loving thoughts, our aspirations, just horizontally out to all sentient beings. May we all find happiness in the causes of happiness. So this went through all of Buddhism. Individually, we can do this. And to understand that our aspirations, our thoughts, our consciousness are as real as anything in the physical world. Often that's considered, oh, but that's merely thoughts, merely wish. No, the mind is a fundamental force of nature. Our prayers, our thoughts, our aspirations, let alone the ultimate ground. And to never diminish, or how do you say, marginalize the power of prayer, of our aspirations. On the other hand, especially in Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, there are prayers to the divine, the many facets of the divine, whether like to Tara, the personification, the female personification of compassion, prayers to Tara. May Tara's blessings flow down upon us, relieving the suffering, dispelling the causes of suffering, but also, as in especially the Roman Catholic tradition, making prayers to the great saints, the great sages of the past, as intermediaries, for example. And so in this way, this sacred tension, drawing inwards to prayer, to contemplation, inner purity, drawing on our own deepest resources, but also knowing there's a time to exhale, to come out of meditation, and to be of practical benefit in any way we can. So I think these two are equally important. They're complementary, and they're not in any kind of opposition to each other.
Thank you. Yes, I think we're on the same wavelength again, but two illustrations come to my mind, one from the 14th century and the other from this century. One is The Cloud of Unknowing, written in England in the 14th century, a little book on Christian meditation, in which he says, this work of meditation, which means the work we do every morning, every evening, our daily meditation, has a real and immense influence, how we do not know, on or cannot observe. Jesus said we cannot observe the kingdom coming. So it's outside of the realm of objective observation. Nevertheless, he said, it does have a real effect upon the world around us and upon, he says, the souls in purgatory. By that, he's talking about this whole layer or dimension of reality in which there is suffering, both whether it's on this side of this life or on the other side. So he had absolute quiet clarity and insight into the way in which this work of contemplation, which is the work we're doing in meditation, has an effect. It touches all dimensions of reality. And the reason for that ultimately would be that it is the work of love. We love what we pay attention to. We pay attention to what we love. This work is the work of pure attention. And the other illustration comes from the great film Interstellar, which I think integrates a lot of the latest knowledge about physics. And now we're not conscious just of 3 or 4 dimensions of reality, but any number, maybe 44, 46 dimensions of reality and still counting. And the point being made at the end of the film is that the two forces in the universe which can pass through all of those, the only two forces that can pass through all of those dimensions of reality are gravity and love. And when we meditate, we are being grounded, we are being rooted, we're sitting on the ground. We are obeying the law of gravity, being pulled to the center of the planet, the center of the universe. So gravity is there, and we are doing the work of love because we are taking the attention off ourselves and placing it outwards selflessly and making ourselves available. And the fruit of that will be, as you were saying, Alan, that we will be better able, more freely, to give ourselves to the needs of others.
I'm reminded of a very brief comment made by His Holiness Dalai Lama when he was asked, "Do you ever feel lonely?" From the time he was a child, isolated in that great big potala with no playmates. And he answered, "No, I never feel lonely. I always feel connected with others." And to my mind, this points to the union or the unification of this flowing outwards and this drawing inwards. That as we draw inwards, as Eva was just saying, we're drawing inwards beyond this encapsulation of I, me, and mine to a deeper ground. And we're drawing all sentient beings into this simplicity, into our hearts. So we're not drawing from the world, we're drawing the world into our hearts. And then when we come out, we are bringing with us our contemplative awareness, our thought, whatever we've cultivated in practice. So there's a merging between the two. And a final point, in Buddhism, it said there are two ways of cultivating loving kindness. And one of this is by acting in a loving way, coming out into the world in a way that is charitable, loving, and affectionate, and attentive. And the other way is by drawing inwards and meditatively cultivating loving kindness. So we see that there can be a complete union between the two.
There was just before I'm going to Leo, there was another question there about what insights have we come to through this. Should we?
Yeah, that was the second. Yeah.
Should we try to respond to that one? What insight? What was the form of the question?
What insights have come into your awareness with the current pandemic?
Maybe Eva, perhaps?
Well, I'll actually express something that had started to grow for me some months ago, I guess, different times. From this very question of the efficacy of prayer and how can the intentions arising in this one person's heart actually affect a world in pain? And I should have known this a long time ago, but it started to come as a new insight, which is, insofar as in the Buddhist worldview, our world is being primarily shaped by our mental perceptions. Of course, there's physical matter, but the way that causes and conditions come into being, the most powerful influence, the most powerful force is our minds. And to recognize that, to verbalize and to have mental prayer first, and then to verbalize that and to bring one's entire being into the intention of that prayer. As you were just saying, Father Laurence, that is a force that cannot be stopped because it is a trajectory of mind. And because it's pure, as we were speaking of pure the other day, it won't be trembled, it won't be constricted by mental afflictions, by wrong views, by misperceptions. It is a pure stream, which is in harmony with ultimate reality, which is in harmony with divine awareness that wants all men to be saved, that wants all living beings to find their highest genuine happiness. And so insofar as our prayers are in accord with reality and not our selfish wishes that are somehow in discord with the ground of reality, our prayers aren't just ours. They're like, well, now it comes to mind as St. Paul says, we make up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ, but we also contribute to the prayer of Christ. And it's not as though there's anything lacking in Christ's prayer, but insofar as more and more and more of us make our reality our prayer, then what could stop that force? And so I can start to envision those deep layers, things that happen because we don't know why, being shaped by our prayer. And so in this current pandemic, the call to awareness that has become global, perhaps in an unprecedented way, because no one can escape this. It affects every single level of society across these terms of first world, second world, third world. No one is immune, literally, no one is immune. And no one is immune to the fear, no one is immune to the economic ramifications, no one is immune to the global ramifications. And so insofar as we can take refuge in the deepest level of prayer, joining to these universal prayers of awakened beings, then that could create a groundswell, a critical mass of goodness in this world that could actually perhaps start to change some major problems that we've wondered, how is it ever going to change, around the environment, around politics, around social discord, that this crisis can be an opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm seeing this from many different directions now that I've opened up a bit from retreat. That this force of unified prayer can change things that we hadn't been able to change before the crisis. So I'll leave it there.
Laurence?
Yours to add?
No, Laurence, I'd love to hear from you. Or maybe the next, as you wish, Leo.
Yeah. Well, I think in one sense, every day is a crisis. But when you're in a very intense, obvious, tangible crisis like today, it's very, here living at Bombo, we keep our same schedule. We ring the bell, unless somebody forgets to ring the bell. We ring the bell 15 minutes before we go up. Now we're meditating in the barn where we'll be having mass tomorrow, be online. And so the rhythm of life continues. And we're very conscious that everything is different. We can't have guests, we can't have retreats, we can't have seminars, but we are developing our outreach through the Contemplative Path program. So what do we do? The insight that comes to me is that you have to do the next thing. You just have to do the next thing that should be done with detachment and wholeheartedness. And you don't know whether it's going to be useful, you don't know what's going to happen next, and not thinking about the reward. I think it's like meditation itself. You have to put everything you are into it, and then you have to take everything you are and have out of it. And what's left might be useful. What's left might be your true self, your good work. So I think that's what I'm learning more through this crisis, is the importance of a rhythm of life. St. Benedict calls it prayer, work, and study. And that should be organized and lived in a ordered, regular way as much as possible, rather than chaotic, respecting the harmony of the body, the mind, and the spirit. And then we do the next thing we have to do. So the predictability is in the schedule, in the rhythm of life, time for meditation, time for a meal, time to sit and watch a movie together. There's something predictable about it, but the big picture we can't predict. So we have to do the next thing with as much presence of mind as possible. And that combination of the two is how to get through a crisis and how to get through life.
I have a thought to share about insights. In a lot of the Buddhist, Christian, or interfaith dialogues of which I've been aware in the past, I have a sense that it often comes down to a sense, well, in terms of what we believe to be reality, what is true, well, we have our differences. but we can live with them. But where we find unity is in the skillful means, in loving kindness, in service, in generosity, the many other virtues. But of course, we do fundamentally differ about the nature of reality. I've seen that come up quite a few times. And yet from the conversation we've had over the last several days, at a very deep level, it seems to me just the opposite. And that is when I'm hearing you, when it comes to the intercontemplative kind of dialogue, I simply keep on seeing convergence and convergence and convergence. But the skillful means of the Mass, well, the Buddhists don't have Mass. And the Buddhists have many rituals and meditations you don't find in Christianity or in Hinduism and so forth. It seems to me that it's really the skillful means that are different and something utterly to celebrate, because we don't all find the same skillful means, the rituals, the prayers, the activities. We don't all find them equally. You know, we want a variety there. But the deeper we go in view, I'm just seeing differences melt away. And so it seems to me just the opposite of the view that's often at least implicit there. View, well, we're fundamentally different, but skillful means, well, we all celebrate humanity, you know, the virtues and so forth. I think it's the opposite. That's my sense. But this is intercontemplative dialogue rather than interdoctrinal dialogue.
Yes,
and both the value, I'm not dismissing the value or the importance of doctrine, but again, the finger pointing to the moon. What's it all for? Just as Aquinas, St. Thomas said, what's it all for? The political life, the hedonic life, the pursuit of mundane. What's it all for when you have food, clothing, shelter, lodging, and medical care, education? What's it all for? And it's all for the contemplative. The pursuit of hedonia is all for the sake of eudaimonia. And this is a fundamental point of unification. And everything else is skillful means.
So we have two more questions that are also related with the crisis, but it's more the impact in the spiritual practice. So let me just. So the first one is, what insights have, sorry, that's repeating. Would it be possible to address the specific challenges of practicing in this time of great pain, anxiety, and fear and self-isolation? This is from Anne Lynch. The other one is directed to Alan. So probably, maybe you can start, Alan. This experience of isolation due to present circumstances has made me more aware of my desire for children's flourishing, both as a mother and as a teacher, and not being able to teach them during the confinement, desire for companionship, my attachments to life. This shouted out more loudly to me and came as a surprise to me, how much I still want to do to manifest. Could Alan comment on this in terms of present circumstance and Buddhist practice as a householder? From Elder.
I'll do so, and again, I'll try to be brief because I'd like to see the dynamism of dialogue take place rather than simply a long monologue. This does relate, I believe, back to the theme I briefly introduced, that of the spiritual tension, a spiritual tension. And that is our wish to go out, to take care of loved ones, to take care of those who rely upon us, our children, friends, family, local community. This is a noble aspiration. This is not a compromise with the spiritual life, but can in fact be an expression of the spiritual life. As we come out, but not, again, as Eva was suggesting, not coming out with this my family, I, me, mine, focusing on I, me, mine as we go out, but cutting through that and recognizing our families are like families everywhere. But it's a noble aspiration to want to come out, not, oh, I wish I weren't so attached, or I wish I didn't have so much desire. But knowing as we come out, what are we bringing out? Are we bringing our anxiety? Are we bringing our self-centeredness? Are we bringing fear? Are we bringing attachment in an afflictive sense? Or have we gone deep enough within that when we come out, we are offering our best? And when we go back in, we're bringing everybody back in with us, that integration of going out, going in. So I see no conflict there and no sense of, oh, I wish I didn't have such desire. Because if that desire is pure, as Eva was saying, coming from a very deep space, that too is an expression of a meditative practice and not a deviation or an interlude from it. And the other question?
About the challenges, wasn't it, to our practice?
Yeah, the challenges, because of the time of pain, anxiety, and fear and self-isolation. The challenges of practice, keep the practice.
I'd like something very brief. And that is, I think, a very helpful distinction in Buddhism when we speak of compassion. Compassion is more than sympathy, more than empathy, more than that. Compassion is an aspiration rooted in empathy. But for compassion to come to full blossom, we must see there is a possibility of at least alleviation, perhaps even freedom from suffering. So in this pandemic, there's a way very straightforward of containing this pandemic. It's not just out of our control. And so we see there is a possibility to contain this quite quickly. If we all together follow the guidelines of the health professionals, we can contain it. And so this is compassion. May we all be free, and may we do whatever's necessary to bring about that freedom. There is hope, but we have to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. Maybe Eva?
Yeah, this is several different things that come to mind, and they're all themes that I've heard you teach on many times, Alan. Both of these questions and comments make me reflect on the nature of solitary retreat itself when it's chosen. When I've often thought, oh, this is voluntary solitary confinement, and it's often given me deep empathy with prisoners. But now when we're in a situation where, I don't even know the numbers, hundreds of thousands or millions of people are now effectively in retreat without necessarily having any training in how to do that. I think this is showing us the pain of isolation if we don't have a practice and a ground of being in which to meditate. But for those of us who have a practice, who had some training prior to the crisis in meditation, and I'm sure many of those listening fall in that category, it's still a challenge because we are forced to see how dissatisfied we still are with our solitude. And so there, I guess, 3 themes that came to mind. One is the infirmary, one is not doing, and one is dealing with, fear that doesn't have an object. So a teaching that Alan often gives as sort of the first step of shamatha practice or stillness practice, he's called the infirmary. And I find it very interesting how millions more people are being affected by this illness than have ever contracted it, insofar as we are forced to be as though we are sick people. And I think this could also be very healing in the sense that, when we are sick, we need to rest. We need to go inside and let the body heal based on the deep natural forces, the divine forces within us that know how to heal us. And again, a theme that Alan has touched on many times in the past is mental afflictions are more contagious than any disease. And we know very well that our world has been rampant with the contagion of anger, jealousy, attachment in the negative sense of trying to get what we want at the expense of others, pride, competition, crippling doubt, and so on and so forth. The mental afflictions that are the root of sin, are the root of all bad deeds. And insofar as we are forced into quarantine, we're forced to look at our minds and see the afflictions in our mind. That's what religious retreat is primarily about, is, as we spoke before, being able to see our minds in all its beauty and all its ugliness, and just let go of the ugliness, drop it, not follow it. But insofar as we are all now forced to go into the solitude of our cell, as the Desert Fathers speak of, sit in your cell and your cell will teach you, we have an opportunity to heal, whether we've been infected with disease, with the coronavirus or not. As I say, many more of us not infected by the virus, but able to see how we've been infected by mental afflictions our whole lives. And so being forced to rest can be very painful at first. But I offer, from what little experience over these, especially these last 2.5 years in full-time retreat, one gets used to that solitude and starts to see the purification that takes place in it, sees the body and mind's natural capacity for healing. And then we start to see the value of not doing. And this ties right back to what I said earlier, which is, can we trust the universal prayer of Christ? We speak of it, from a Christian perspective, we speak of it in the Mass, in joining the daily office, the prayer of the church throughout the world. But not until we're actually forced not to be able to do all the things we want to go out and do, as both of these questions addressed, do we have to take refuge in a deeper doing, the divine act. In Buddhism, the Chinle, or the enlightened activity of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Somehow trust that even when we physically and verbally can't affect the people we want to help, that in our forced solitude, we can stand or sit or lie down in a monumental stillness and a not doing that allows the divine doing to work through us in pure prayer, as we've spoken of. So that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. I think what you say, Eva, throws a light upon the responsibility of people like yourself, like us here in Bombo and Alan, your Sangha, who are able to give a good part of their life, time-wise, to spiritual practice and teaching. So contemplatives in a more professional sense, and that is a real service to the world. I have no doubt about that. But I think, there's also another kind of challenge, which is the challenge to us. I feel it myself, and I've discussed it with our community, and the different teachers in our community recently. What is the challenge to us as the world community for Christian meditation? How to respond to this situation? And I think we've decided that what we can do and should do is give ourselves as fully as we can to sharing the gifts of this tradition and of the gifts of our community, the teaching on practice, introducing people to meditation who are at home, who haven't had a spiritual path before, and are looking for something very immediate and quick and urgent. Sometimes the 3 million people in the US who signed up for unemployment because they've lost their jobs. So that's a huge challenge to us, and we're trying to respond to that with our Contemplative Path program. Then there's the challenge for every individual who is affected by this in any way. When you sit down to meditate, your mind is agitated. It's more agitated than usual. Our feelings are aroused and unpredictable. Maybe new feelings are breaking through into our awareness. Normally suppressed fears that we have, like the fear of death, which we normally keep safely on hold, that can come up. And so when we sit down to meditate, we have the challenge of facing our agitated mind and agitated feelings. This challenge requires that we are in touch with practitioners, with people, with fellow pilgrims, and if we haven't ever done this before, with people who can teach us at least the first steps on how to go beyond that agitation to that deeper peace within us. there's the challenge of living with uncertainty. Nobody likes that, really. We like surprises, but we like to control our surprises. And so to be conscious of this challenge of radical uncertainty. Will I get it? If I get it, will I get it seriously? Or would it be a mild attack? Or will I die from it? Or with my parents or my children or whatever? So living with uncertainty, we know scientifically that it's much easier for a meditator, from the effects on the brain, it's much easier to live with uncertainty if you have a contemplative practice. You're simply able to be more realistic about the fact you can't control everything. So there's a practical, pragmatic, scientifically, biologically, neurologically proven efficacy there. Meditation will help you live more in a more balanced way with the uncertainty of the times. And the last challenge, I think, is pain or suffering. Not quite the same thing, but aspects of the same thing. Dukkha in Sanskrit, the unsatisfactoriness of life, of disappointments, of being let down, of having our hopes shattered, our plans put on hold or destroyed. So how do we deal with pain and suffering? Our first reaction to it is to withdraw into ourselves, because it's my pain, it's my hopes that have been disappointed, my suffering that is overwhelming me, that I feel in the pit of my stomach and it's keeping me awake at night. So it's my pain. But the challenge is to be able to see that that pain that isolates us can also become a bridge between ourselves and others. Because we are not the only people who are suffering. We are not the only people who are feeling this kind of pain. And therefore, compassion builds a bridge, a connection. And real wisdom comes when we see, and this is something we will be reflecting on deeply in Holy Week as we reflect on the passion of Christ, the death and suffering of Christ, that if we can accept our pain and suffering, and if we can see it as a bridge between ourselves and others, we have found healing. So those are some of the challenges I feel we face, and we all face individually, but we face as a contemplative community as well.
Laurence, I'd like to return to the theme of suffering, especially mental distress. Because in many cases, including right now with the pandemic, if you ask people, why are you unhappy? Why are you feeling ill at ease? And the finger will come out because of the economy, the pandemic, the disease. And if only that would go away out there, then I'd be fine. And likewise, when people feel happy, often they say, I'm happy because my children are very happy, or my job is going well, or the pandemic has died down. Now I'm happy. So this is all the stimulus-driven unhappiness and happiness for which we point outwards to the cause. But the great sages of the past, going Socrates and the Christian, the Buddhist and so forth tradition, speak of this other dimension that I've alluded to in the past, this eudaimonia, for which you don't find any outward stimulus. If you're experiencing genuine well-being, you don't point your finger outwards and said, I'm experiencing this flow of genuine well-being because this happened out in the world. That's back to eudaimonia. So this is clear, the stimulus-driven, the non-stimulus-driven pleasure or joy or satisfaction. But I think to complement that, and that is genuine unhappiness. And I think there's a lot of that going around right now where people are not suffering economically. Many people are, but many people are not. They're getting through it. They're not suffering from the pandemic, but they are isolated. They're quarantined. They're told to stay at home. And so sitting in the quietude of one's chambers, one might find that one feels a profound sense of ill at ease, of discontent, of unhappiness, just the opposite of well-being, ill-being, and I call that genuine unhappiness. Now, we're all carrying this. I'm carrying this. I think by and large, we're all carrying this. But when this genuine unhappiness arises, the natural tendency for many people, I think myself on occasion, is I'm feeling unhappy, ill at ease. And so let's go out and do something. Let's go to the pub. Let's go to work. Let's go to a movie. Let's turn on the telly. Let's do something out there and I'll cover up. Life becomes an anesthetic for smothering genuine unhappiness. And one great 14th century, 14th century Tibetan sage Tsongkhapa said, insofar as, or to the extent that your mind is conditioned, habituated to the ego, the egotism, craving, grasping, jealousy, anger, and so forth, insofar the mind is tainted, then you will find solitude unbearable. Not because of any stimulus, but the mind that you're resting in is afflicted, and the symptom of that is a sense of ill-being. But insofar as the person devoted to the inner life, especially contemplatives, are purifying the mind, then the same self-quarantine, the same self-isolation that is unbearable for a person with no spiritual practice becomes a flow of well-being. And one savors, one relishes the simplicity and the solitude. And so this pandemic can be a time to highlight this genuine unhappiness doesn't go away, and it won't go away when the pandemic subsides. It's a time to focus on this and bring about the inner well-being, so that when we come out, we're expressing inner well-being and not coming out into the world with our inner genuine unhappiness and trying to smother it or cover it over.
Thank you. I think I have to point out that we are causing some interesting conversations among our listeners, some of whom are saying we're talking too much, some of whom are saying, no, let them get on with it. It's interesting. And it's going to be up to Leo to try to find a balance between the two. My suggestion is that we get one shot at each question.
I was going to jump to the next one. Is kind of related to what you're speaking about darkness. So let's just, it's a bit long, but I think it's deep. Where is the darkness which we as human beings have in our human nature? Where is that in the primordial consciousness, which is luminosity and light? Or perhaps how does that light become contaminated by darkness? I can see that ultimately I am God. There is a correspondence in the quality of our consciousness, but I am aware of the darkness in me. How to reconcile that with God being solely luminosity and light? Or is our darkness a consequence of Augustine's idea of privatio bonum, absence of God? From Cloud.
Eva, your turn.
In the tradition of the great perfection, Dzogchen, there is no story of the fall as we would think of it in Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. But there is there are many different mythological stories, as it were, about how the primordial Buddha, Samantabhadra, instantly knows who he is, he being pristine awareness itself. But for each of us, and it's entirely unclear how the differentiation of individual sentient beings ever happens. It's not as though there was once one sentient being that then split off into different ones. And Buddhism never says that. But there's a sense in which every instant at which we fail to see the fundamental light, the luminosity that illuminates all things, that is our own awareness, that is the ground of our awareness. In every instant that we fail to see that, then there's a whole domino effect triggered by that actual obscuration, that darkness. And it's said that this substrate consciousness, as Alan spoke of earlier in the week, the the continuum that's not configured into our human brain or human experiences or human memories, but it's the basso continuo of our awareness, but it's not yet ultimate awareness. It's not at the deepest level of ultimate awareness. That substrate consciousness is of the nature of unawareness. So even though when one reaches, for example, shamatha, or the culmination of stillness meditation that has not yet penetrated through our conditioned awareness, it is luminous, it is blissful, it is free of the constriction of conceptuality as we ordinarily think of it. But it is still permeated by an obscuration, many obscurations. And so it's of the nature of unawareness. And I think that what we feel, maybe what I hear in this beautiful, beautiful question, just the experience of the darkness within ourselves, and that manifests in so many different ways. It manifests as our genuine unhappiness. So even if we haven't had some genuine experience or glimpse of the substrate consciousness in its pure form, we know that we're permeated by this cloud. And I don't mean it as in the cloud of unknowing, just the cloud of our confusion, of our darkness, of our not being able to see clearly. And that could be a doorway, actually, to motivating us to find the luminosity, the ultimate luminosity that is at the ground of our being. Because as long as we're not aware of the darkness, why would we want to break through it? We think we're in the light. But when we become aware of that darkness within our being, and of course not a physical darkness, as I'm speaking and the sun is shining in my eyes, I can still be permeated by that non-knowing, that unknowing. But as we face that darkness and we pray, back to prayer, we pray for the blessing to break through, to see who we really are. For a while, it will become more uncomfortable. And this comes into the discomfort of being in solitude. It will be more uncomfortable to see that darkness within ourselves. And as long as we identify with that darkness, we will be miserable. We see it better, but we're also identifying with it, and then we'll get more miserable. And so this I would tie into actually our fear and the object of our fear. Because we can't help but ask the question, what am I afraid of ultimately? Is it death? Or is it something deeper than death? Is it annihilation? Is it facing the fact I don't know who I am? Is that what terrifies me? I think dealing with the specter of death, of course, can be so helpful, so healing, because we're forced to let go of all the temporal or limited ideas we have of ourselves. They're there, but we have to let go of our attachment to them if we're to be able to face death without just being in a panic all the time. But as we face death more and more clearly, we can take refuge not in anything we think we are, but we can take more and more refuge in the ultimate light. And contemplative life, meditation of many different kinds, can give us the precision of perception, the penetrating kind of perception that starts to break open the veil, reveal the space, to start to see that light that is behind every perception we ever have. And it could be there in a completely dark room. It's not the fact of physical light illuminating things. It's the light of awareness that enables appearances, inner appearances, mental appearances, outer appearances to arise at all. And once we start to tap into that light, then the contraction that occurs when we fall back into our limited darkness becomes more obvious. there's not too much more I can say about it right now, but I hope that might be an inspiration for many of you to study more deeply, because I think these teachings really do appear both in the Christian contemplative tradition and in Buddhism. How can we start to take refuge in the light that is the ground of all things, moment by moment by moment, and how will that penetrate our darkness? And so as long as we try to hear or identify with a phrase, I am divine, and we haven't done that work of penetrating the darkness, then it will only turn into hubris. And I think we know that. And that's why certainly in the Christian tradition, we avoid that kind of language, except at the most rarefied levels. So the humility of prayer, the humility of devotion that says, no, God is other than me. God must break through me. God must penetrate me, until we're not grasping onto anything anymore. And then it's not even an I who can say, I am God or I am divine. There is simply the light, the divine light.
Thank you. I'll just say one thing on this question of darkness, and thank you, Claudia, for raising it. And Claudia, a friend of our community, who's in London. I'm hoping she'll contribute to the Contemplative Path program with some reflection from her professional wisdom on the psychological effects of this time of crisis that we're passing through. I would just take briefly an evolutionary approach. It's not enough to say that darkness is the result of illusion. You know, illusions have big effects. The illusion of a master race led to the Second World War. The illusion that his wife was betraying him led Othello to strangle Desdemona. So illusions can have really bad, real effects. The way I find it helpful is simply to think of it in evolutionary terms, the emergence of human consciousness. The Buddhists always say, be grateful that you're born a human rather than a frog. We've got lots of frogs being born in our lake here at the moment. So the emergence of human consciousness comes from all the preceding levels of evolution, all the preceding levels of consciousness through history, since the Big Bang. And we have all of these in us. We are microcosms of the universe. And we include in us the remnants or the layers or the strata of many of our humanoid ancestors, the different humanoid species that didn't make it to our elevated status of Homo sapiens. But we've got all of this in us floating around. And we, individually and collectively, are emerging still out of that, out of lower levels of consciousness. And the lower level of consciousness is dark by comparison with a higher level of consciousness. So darkness, I think you could say, is the pain of birth, or the pain of emerging, of pushing forth, evolving, spiritual growth, we call it. It's just expanding and fulfilling our potential, but it hurts because we are breaking away, separating from those earlier stages. The birth itself is light and is joy, but the darkness out of which we are coming is painful. The birthing is a painful process as we, from the womb into the world. So it may not be the only way of looking at it, but it's a helpful way I find a hopeful way of looking at the process.
Did you have more to add?
Leo, maybe more questions.
Okay. Well, we can go for two more, next ones. So one is about love, how to become love and meditation. So all the traditions teach that love is not a verb, but is a state. We become love as God is love. Yet, how do we finite humans who hardly know eternity become love? Isn't it meditation when we see ourselves in others without judgment, when we are one with all, only then that we come to know love? That is love. That's from Lam. And the next one is about the heart. It seems in all traditions we are instructed to connect to our hearts in order to be open, at peace, or with God. But what exactly is the heart is not an organ. And how do we connect to it? From Matthew.
Shall I start, Laurence?
Please.
All right. Again, as the Dalai Lama has commented that, you spoke of evolution, Laurence. The Dalai Lama has commented that by the power of evolutionary forces, natural selection and so forth, mothers need to take care of their children. Fathers need to take care of their children, otherwise your species vanishes. Need to take care of our children, our families, those with whom we identify, but especially family. And that comes quite spontaneously and effortlessly. But of course, in this biological imperative of love, caring for, cherishing, wishing to the other to find happiness, there tends to be almost universally a demarcation between mine and not mine. My children, not my children. My family, not my family. And so then this is where attachment comes in. I will care for those who are mine, but I have to be careful of those or ward off or even dominate those who are not mine. And so the spiritual life, and I think this is across the board, Christian, Buddhist, and so forth, is to take that which is already given. We already care for those who are close to us. And then through contemplative practice, through prayer, through meditation, break down the barriers between my side and your side, until Christians look upon all creatures as God's children. Buddhists look upon all beings as imbued with Buddha nature. But in our modern world, many people don't know what it means to love themselves. There's judgment, there's harshness, there's lack of self-worth, a sense of disappointing oneself and others. And so in classic Buddhist practice, we actually turn this loving, caring, affectionate, non-judgmental way of viewing to ourselves first. We genuinely find that we are lovable. And that's the catalyst for loving kindness, as we understand in Buddhism, attending to the other, attending to the self as lovable, as worthy of love, despite some appearances, terrible behavior, dominance of mental afflictions on occasion. But I am not my behavior, I am not my mental afflictions. And despite the fact that I am still subject to them on occasion, am I at all times worthy of love? And the answer must be yes. If we can understand there's something lovable in ourselves and then turn to where it's easiest, our families, spouses, children, relatives, friends, and extend outwards, not just seeing them as attractive or helpful to me or agreeable or giving me pleasure, but seeing the lovableness in each of those whom we naturally love. And then turning to the stranger, the person behind the cash register in the store, the bank teller, the person we pass in the street, and seeing this person too as lovable. And then finally, to what His Holiness Dalai Lama speaks so gently as the mischief makers, those people, individuals, groups, who are wreaking havoc on our world, contributing to misery, to conflict, to decimation of the environment, and seeing them also, while their behavior is not lovable in any way, sin is not lovable, mental afflictions are not lovable, but the people who are dominated by them are, even in the darkest hour. And in this way, love expands until it just becomes universal. And there's no sense of separation between I, the individual who loves, and that which all those who are loved. And then we're simply dwelling in love. And this must come down to its root, dwelling in the Holy Spirit, dwelling in pristine awareness, from which loving kindness arises effortlessly, naturally, and without barrier.
Thank you. I agree, of course, that we have to learn to love. Lam's question is, how do we become love? Learning how to become love is being divinized, sharing fully in the nature of God, as St. Peter calls it. So we have to learn to love ourselves, and we have to learn to love other people, and then in that process, we become loving, we become love. But I think there's a primary step, which is we have to be loved. And if we don't feel and know that we are loved, then we are very inadequate in learning to love ourselves or love other people. We may do it well, and we may do the best we can, but we'll experience a lot of dissatisfaction and a lot of sense of failure. And St. John says in the letter of John, the love I speak of is not our love for God, but God's love for us, because God loved us first. It's a very simple way of putting it. You could translate that psychologically and of course into the family life. If the child does not feel that he or she has been loved in those very early days, formative minutes, days, months, and years, then their capacity for love is damaged. And therefore their capacity to become fully human is damaged. And therefore their capacity to become God is damaged. It's not all bad news, because the love of God penetrates into that realm of suffering and incompleteness and sin, and that's what Christianity focuses on very much through the incarnation and through the passion of Christ. And so the love of God penetrates into our wounded condition and starts the work of healing. But it doesn't do it magically. It does it spiritually, directly, and mystically. I think when we sit to meditate, we are simply allowing ourselves to be touched by that love of God to the best of our ability. And if we stay with it, we will feel it. And it will trigger a process of healing. And we'll find that we become more loving. But it's not, even that is not enough. Because we also have to see and feel that love that with which we are loved from other people. And so, love one another as I have loved you, Jesus says. That's his commandment. That's it. It's nothing else. It's the visa into nirvana, into heaven, into the fullness of humanity. To learn to love as I have loved you. So knowing that we are loved is the way, ultimately, the first step. And even if we started off in a very damaged way, all is not lost. We can be redeemed.
I would love to then connect these themes to the second question about the heart. As I indicated on Thursday, there are many Buddhist practices that use active visualization to help us find this energetic center to our being that is not an organ, that is within what is known as the subtle body, which is a complex, and now I'm speaking in Vajrayana Buddhist terms, a complex system, circuitry system of energies that move in a certain way consistently. It is like a circuit, and the chakras are not inherently there, but they are formed by the way that certain energies flow consistently. And actually those chakras are understood to be formed by our mental afflictions, by our misperceptions of reality. The energies are flowing in a constricted way, and so they create blockage points within the energetic system. But it's understood that what's known as the indestructible or this heart of hearts contains, it's very hard to use physical language, but one needs to use physical language in this context. It is the locus for the extremely subtle energies and mind, consciousness, that according to Vajrayana theory goes from lifetime to lifetime. But one could think of it as like a stream from which, say this right, it's a stream through time, but it's utterly still because it doesn't move anywhere. It projects a world in which things move. And so it is from the very subtle energies and mind in that indestructible bindu that then there's a detailed description of how the subtle body forms in the womb during the gestation period and eventually coagulates and shapes coarse matter itself into a physical body such as we know it as human beings. This could apply to other species and other kinds of animals, but I'll speak of human beings at the moment. But that heart is still there. The indestructible bindu still dwells at our center and our body formed around it. And the heart chakra, as it's described, is an array of energies that is actually constricting that innermost orb of energy and consciousness. And so through the practice of love and ever deepening wisdom, the energies that constrict our heart actually start to release. Again, they're very complex, long, detailed sequences of teachings around this, but I'm trying to get to the core of it. So as those energies begin to release, this bindu, this orb of light, naturally manifests its openness, its non-duality. I don't even want to say connectedness anymore. It's non-duality with the indestructible orb at the heart of every other living being. And if we return to these teachings on the Trinitarian structure of the ground of being, in which there is ultimate reality, the wisdom that perceives ultimate reality, and the energy which in another context could be called great bliss or ultimate joy. And of course, I find that so deeply connected with the notion of the Holy Spirit as the love between, the eternal love between the Father and the Son. So what I'm trying to say, and very much in congruence with what Lam expressed, love is constituent of reality itself. And this goes across the board from the great perfection, Vajrayana Buddhism, Theravada, where it says the nature of consciousness is loving kindness, right? And in Christianity. So that the more deeply we access the energies that are always present at our heart of hearts, we are accessing the energy of love that literally makes the universe go round. And a place where our love for others is non-dual, because we're not loving them as someone else, we're tapping into the ground of creative love that is the source of all being. And so if then, drawing this back to the everyday level, we can look into someone else's eyes, and it may be perhaps this attenuation that we're all experiencing of only being able to connect with others except our closest family members or spiritual communities, or a workplace with 3 people going to work. Insofar as we connect with the appearances of another person, but we look instead to the depths of who they are, I think this love can start to manifest itself, reveal itself in ways that, as long as we were engaging normally in our ordinary ways, we wouldn't have the reason to try to tap into. So,
okay, we can go to the next one. Would not be true that both Buddhism and contemplative Christianity lead to nothing, no 15, Alan Faulkner.
Shall I begin? It doesn't matter. Or Laurence?
Sure.
We can go back to the teachings on the Great Perfection, the view that I shared from Yangtang Rinpoche. As you withdraw from the outer phenomena, you look into the mirror of your mind, you penetrate through the mirror of your own individuated mind, my mind, your mind, and you're seeking out this inner penetration. What is the nature of that which is aware, the one who is aware? And you come to a not finding. I don't see the characteristics of the one who is aware. There is a non-finding. It is empty of, in my case, my personality, my personal history, my body, my thoughts, and so forth. It's empty of that, empty of all phenomena. And it is a kind of nothing. It is a kind of kenosis, not of creating an emptiness, but releasing all grasping to that which is not I. And seeing in that emptiness of I am as someone separate, individual, autonomous, you are coming to an emptiness, a nothingness. And we find this, I'm living here in the Nada Hermitage, the Nada Carmelite Hermitage, where there's such profound wisdom from St. John of the Cross about the highlighting, the emphasis, centrality of nothing, seeking nothing, wanting to know nothing. We come to that, but then in that nothingness, in that emptiness, it's not barren. It's not a mere vacuity. It's filled with light. And this is the unborn light, the unchanging light, the divine light. And as we emerge from meditation, from this profound, timeless stillness, and we emerge to the world of this and that, from that, spontaneously and effortlessly, flows love, flows compassion, without boundary, without a sense of separation.
You mentioned St. John of the Cross. I have a quotation here I printed out recently from the Spiritual Canticle. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. Where have you hidden? And his commentary on that, well, that's his poem, but his commentary on this as relevant to the question about the nothingness of God is when we pray and we experience powerful sense of vision or possession of God, or he says, or we feel enriched by love and well-being and hope and faith and joy and the Spirit of God. That is not in itself a sign of God's presence. Mm-hmm. And then he says, when we pray, when we meditate, and we find it is dark and dismal and boring and fruitless and sterile and nothing is happening and it's a waste of time, Chadian, that is not a sign of God's absence. And the Pope Francis yesterday, I think, or recently, I read somewhere, conducted a prayer service, and he hardly said anything. Just as when he came out on the balcony to begin his pontificate, and he bowed to the crowd and prayed in silence for some minutes. I think we're entering into a new contemplative era in Christianity and in religion in general, where we are less inclined to think of prayer as asking God to change things according to our specifications, and more ready for us to be changed and transformed in the process. And that's what we won't meditate for very long unless we accept that and learn that. So if God seems nothing or absent at times, it's because God is unknowable to our minds. and reason and even to our emotional intelligence, God is unknowable. And yet, we can experience the transformation of the divine love, divine action in us, the grace. There was a question about grace. I don't know whether we'll get to that. So, in other words, we're dealing with apparent big contradictions. Emptiness is fullness, fullness is emptiness. But there's no other way that we can think or try to understand it except by accepting these paradoxes and just living with the contradictions.
Okay, we can do the two questions about grace. One, where is the place of grace in the Buddha's teaching? Freedom, enlightenment, is from Adriana. The other one is, are we not born into out of original grace, not born into original sin? As I hope that I'm quoting Laurence correctly, from Mike.
One could say there are two strains of causation as we experience it in our samsaric existence from a Buddhist perspective. And again, emphasis on the Vajrayana, on the great perfection. There's karma. There's karma that is driving, cycling, shaping our perceptions according to our beginningless habituations, as it's said. And one might say that generates the constraints of our world, including solidity itself, including the boundaries of time and space and how we can move through it according to the bodies that we experience ourselves to have. But there's a very, very crucial term in Tibetan, Jinlap, which is very often translated as blessing, but it could equally be grace. The literal sense of it is a wave of sparkling, brilliant glory that we're asking for the enlightened beings to pour into us. So Jingilap Dusul is basically saying, pour your grace into me like a wave. And so this is prayed very much in an I-thou relationship to the Buddha, to the great bodhisattvas, to the great manifest teachers of history, such as Guru Rinpoche, Tsongkhapa, so many others. And the idea is that, first of all, we need to pray in order to open ourselves to that grace. And I'm sure this sounds very familiar from a Christian perspective as well. We must pray, or we have not opened our consciousness to receive that wave that actually is always flowing. Because as long as we're not praying for it and we're getting caught up in our own little samsaric cycles of thinking and acting, then we won't notice the grace. We won't be able to receive the grace. But when we pray for it and we receive it, because it is always flowing, that actually changes our capacity. It changes the spiritual voltage, as it were, that we have within us to be able to understand teachings, to be able to practice, to be able to care for others, to all sorts of things, whatever virtuous thing it may be that we wish to do. Receiving that grace is as though we're opening the floodgates to the divine energy that creates everything good in any case. And so I think it's a common misperception for those who are not directly immersed in the Vajrayana and Dzogchen traditions of Tibet, because that's where it's emphasized the most, It's not it's not entirely absent in other traditions of Buddhism, but it's sometimes not emphasized. And it's sometimes really not emphasized when Buddhism has come to countries that were non-Buddhist for the last several thousand years. But it is absolutely there. For sure it is there. In fact, it is so fundamental that they say no realizations whatsoever can come unless one is praying for and receiving this grace from the Buddhas, and very often specifically through the conduit of the teacher with whom one has personal relationships. So that is the notion of the guru or the lama, who is the conduit for that grace, and through one's own faith in the presence of all Buddhas directly, fully in that teacher, one can receive those blessings all the more swiftly. And what comes to mind now is Simeon, the new theologian, who perhaps uniquely among any Christian mystic that I have read, explained how he viewed his own spiritual teacher, his Abba, as Christ himself. And then when his mystical experiences, his visionary experiences started to come, he actually saw his teacher in heaven with Christ. And so he explains it in a way that's so parallel to the Buddhist teachings on this. It's through his unwavering faith in his spiritual guide that he saw all the blessings of Christ, of the Holy Spirit, to have transformed him. And he was willing to teach this kind of faith and say, if you don't have this, you won't be able to have those kinds of experiences. Now, of course, there are many perspectives on this within Christianity. But I feel this is a very important part of our ongoing dialogue, is to recognize that the role of grace and of faith in Buddhism is central.
I'd like to add just a footnote to that. And that is the whole theme of karma that we find so prominent in Buddhism. Really is an expression of the theme of as you sow, so shall you reap. Buddha's worldview, we sow seeds, karmic seeds, by our virtuous and non-virtuous deeds in this lifetime that come to maturation in future lifetimes. So it's a Buddhist view. But also as you sow, so shall you reap can be understood within this world. And that is, we've been violating the environment for at least 150 years. That's when it's gone exponential. And now we are seeing, through the global climate change and so forth, the harvest of the seeds that we have sown. Now, this is not metaphysical, it's not based on belief system, but the coronavirus itself is something that was created due to human activity and not simply an act of nature. So there's that. But on the other hand, we have, again, this theme of grace, of blessing. It can be used synonymously. But the flow of blessings from the divine, which is now very central to all of Mahayana Buddhism, central to my worldview as a Buddhist, is not something that is like a faucet that turns off and on. When the pandemic subsides, oh, this is the blessings of Buddha. But when it came, oh, I guess that blessing turned off for a while. It's not like that. That the deeper one goes in one's contemplative experience, deeper one approaches this view of the great perfection, seeing reality from the perspective of pristine awareness. One sees that the flow of blessing is constant. It's from all sides. And one sees from one's own perspective, from my perspective, even this pandemic can be seen for me as a blessing. To deepen my sense of renunciation, my compassion, my wisdom, my spirit of altruism, this is a blessing for me. It's not saying it's a blessing for other people. It's as you sow, so shall you reap. But for me, as I go deeper into the practice, we see more and more homogeneously that the flow of blessings from the divine, from all of the Buddhas, is constant, but I don't see it when my mind becomes cramped and locked down into, I want this, I want that, and so forth. So I think there's a profound common ground here, but I would leave that to you, Laurence.
Thank you.
Or am I wrong?
No, I just accept all that you both said. I would say, I would just add this thought that grace is simply the name we give to the divine presence. as it impinges on us in particular circumstances, when we are able to notice it. Sometimes we notice it, sometimes we don't. And often in suffering, we are able to notice it because we're surprised. We're surprised, for example, that although this is a time of great suffering, there is also something else positive being taught to us. Some other door opening or other dimension opening that we weren't aware of before. So grace is always there, but in certain circumstances, we may be more sensitive to it. So that grace is the highest, because the divine presence is the ground of being, the deepest level of consciousness. Therefore, it is higher than the law of karma. And grace dissolves karma.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus died for our sins, we say. And that's the way I think we should see or can see the cross. And finally, in terms of divine grace, we speak about grace entering or God coming. We pray to God to come in and make things better. But when God enters into this dialogue here, we've got so many hundreds of people around the world. If there was one more participant and God decided to come in and join, we wouldn't go up by one.
Mm.
Or if we had 50 chairs in a room and they were all occupied and God came into the room, you wouldn't need to put out another chair for God. So God enters, but he doesn't displace anything that's there. His presence, if we are sensitive to it, intervenes and makes a difference, but without interfering, without taking away our responsibility or our dignity, our control, or indeed our God-likeness. Because otherwise God would be being impatient with us. I think grace in this sense then gives us an insight into the nothingness of God, in the sense of God's letting go, of God's infinite reticence or self-control. That, we tend to step in and take over and control things if we see they're going wrong. God doesn't do that in our way. But it's that infinite self-control, if you like, or reticence or withdrawing of God, which is his way of releasing infinite love into the system. And it's that infinite love that dissolves karma.
So I think we have 20 minutes. Should we stop now and go for meditation? Or
Yes. Alan is going to lead us in a Tonglen practice for 10 or 15 minutes, maybe a little less, so that we stay more or less in, anyway. And then we'll move into a time of silence.
Practice we're about to begin, called Tonglen, literally means to send and to receive or take in. And I found it to be a very profound bridge between core Mahayana contemplative practice and Christian. I'll try to use as few words as possible that are still sufficient. As we begin by bringing our awareness into the present moment, into this field of sensations, of feeling embodied, and settling the body in a sense of ease, stillness, and vigilance. Settling the respiration in its natural rhythm, allowing the body to breathe without intervention, so that from breath to breath, it takes in just what it needs and releases what it does not. Breathing equally. And we settle the mind willfully, in a state of ease, releasing all our hopes and fears, concerns about the future, the past. Existential ease that is fearless. And come to rest in this stillness of awareness that is naturally luminous, unmoving. Awareness has the two qualities of cognizance, of knowing, and of luminosity, which entails its creativity. So as we now move into the main practice, if you will, visualize symbolically this pristine awareness, this Holy Spirit, the kingdom of heaven within, however you conceive of it. But this divine ground of being that is primordially pure, luminous, of the very nature of love. Imagine this symbolically as an orb of incandescent, radiant light in the very center of your chest, the ground of your being, the source of all virtue, of all well-being. Your center. And from this perspective, as we turn our attention to ourselves, our future, let us do so in a spirit of loving kindness and compassion. As we imagine the person who will become tomorrow and next year and following that, bring to mind the fears and anxieties about the future, our own future. The suffering that we dread, mental afflictions that may manifest. And as you breathe in this darkness of unknowing, the darkness of sin, the darkness of suffering. Breathe it in with the aspiration, may I be free. And dissolve this darkness into this fathomless light at your heart, where the darkness disappears into the light without trace, with each in-breath. Imagine becoming free here and now. And as you breathe out, arouse the aspiration of loving kindness. May I be truly well and happy. May I find the true causes of happiness. May I find the fulfillment I seek. And with every out-breath, as you're breathing into yourself, as you will unfold in the future, rooted in the present, imagine light flowing from your heart, suffusing, purifying, filling with love your entire being, that you become love, become a being of light. May I be truly well and happy. From from the very ground of being. And expand the field of your awareness, your heart, and embrace those around you. In your immediate vicinity, human and non-human. With each inhalation, arouse the same aspiration. May each of us, the center of our own world, may each be free of suffering and its causes. As you breathe in, draw on this darkness of those around you. Relieve them from it, uncloak them from it, and dissolve this darkness into your heart, where it vanishes without trace. And breathe out the light of loving kindness to all those around you. May each one, as precious as I am, each one present in the eyes of the Lord, in the eyes of all the Buddhas. Breathe out the light. Embrace them in the light. Let them be suffused by that light. Imagine them finding the happiness that they most deeply seek. And as you continue to expand the field of awareness of loving kindness and compassion, you may focus on individuals, on communities, where there's special pain, suffering, and fear. Breathe in their darkness and extinguish it. And breathe out from this inexhaustible source the light of loving kindness, expanding and expanding, illuminating the world, embracing each sentient being without exception. May we all be free of suffering and its causes. May we vanquish the darkness. And may we live in the light of genuine well-being, in the light of love, with its root in the very ground of our being. May it be so. Imagine it to be so, here and now. And I pass this torch of light to you, my Dharma brother, Father Laurence.
So with our hearts open to the way the light and the dark can be reconciled, and our fears and our love can be united. Let's open our hearts beyond words, beyond images, and beyond all wanting, in that poverty of spirit, which is a great gift of the Holy Spirit to us. Let's enter into that silence for some time now. Let's conclude with this prayer from the letter to the Ephesians. One of John Main's favorite texts. With this in mind, I kneel in prayer to the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name, that out of the treasures of his glory, he may grant you strength and power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that through faith Christ may dwell in your hearts in love. With deep roots and firm foundations, may you be strong to grasp, with all God's people, what is the height, the length, the depth, and the breadth of the love of Christ, and to know it, although it is beyond knowledge. And so, may you come to fullness of being, the fullness of God's own self. Ainsi soit-il. So thank you. I think it just remains for us now, as it's time for us to fade away into emptiness and impermanence, for me to thank everybody who has made these sessions we've been enriched by and supported by the last week possible. And I thank again Adriano in Rome and Leonardo in Brazil. Thank all of those here, Nicolas here, who's been behind the camera, and all of you who have participated in these sessions so consciously and vivaciously, and really giving so much by your presence and your comments. And personally, I'd like to thank also Alan and Eva for their amazing gifts and generosity, the eloquence, the passion, and the clarity with which they have shared their gifts and the insight, the fruit of their practice with all of us through these dialogues. And it's been a delight and a pleasure and enrichment to me to be with you and to be part of this exploration of our common ground together. And of course, it's not just for us, or even for those who participated. It's something that we are sending out through everyone who's been touched by it to take with them in silence, or in all of the different ways that you will be communicating with other people. Most of us, I think, on this these sessions are locked down or locked in or asked to stay at home, and yet we can communicate. Thank God for the internet and for social media and for technology that works. So through these means now, maybe this is going to transform our attitude towards technology as well these next few weeks, however long it lasts. And let's pray that we can really make the most of this testing, trying and painful and sad time, but we make the most of it and take the fullness of the opportunity. So I'd like to ask, and just to remind you also, this is the first event in our contemplative path through the crisis program, which has grown out of many requests that we've received and conversations with our teachers in the community worldwide. So the contemplative path through the crisis is launched now with these dialogues, and it will be continuing. If you would like to sign up for it, then you'll get direct information about it, and there'll be a very wide range of content and events and resources. And of course, it's all available also directly on our website, as will these talks and recordings. So just to let you know, tomorrow, Sunday, we'll be celebrating a contemplative Mass in our new barn, our conference room, and you're most welcome to join us for that. It will be at 12 o'clock French time, noon French time, and it will be celebrating a simple Mass with short commentary on the readings and meditation after communion. So a way for us to be united in that sacramental, symbolic way as well. So I'd like to ask Alan and Eva to say a closing word. I think we don't have time for the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which we were going to play a little of. Maybe we will, after we conclude, Leo, after we finished, those of you who'd like to stay on for, I think it's 3 or 4 minutes. There's an amazing video somebody sent me recently, YouTube, of a group of musicians who were all self-isolating in Holland. And they decided that they would play the Ode to Joy, Beethoven's Ode to Joy, together. And it was quite a challenge, but if you can stay and listen to this, it takes 3 or 4 minutes. It's very inspiring, and maybe it shows us what we've been doing also. We've been playing this music together in our different places, in this common ground of the internet and technology, and it has produced, I think, joy. And I thank all of you who have been part of this creation of joy in this time of crisis. So a final word from Alan and Eva, and then we say goodbye until next time, and thank you. And then Leo will do au revoir, and then Leo will play this video if you want to stay for it for 4 or 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Laurence, for this wonderful opportunity to commune across the seas, and all of you who have enabled it to happen. In this time of crisis, time of unprecedented challenge in some ways, insofar as we're looking outwards to what will make me happy out there, what will make me suffer out there. We're in a mode of waiting, like a limbo. We're waiting. Will the pandemic be contained? How fast will it be? Will it be in my area? And we don't know. We're waiting. Will a vaccine be found? How soon? Will it be in time to really do some good this round? Or will the pandemic die a natural death and maybe come back next year? It's waiting. It's waiting in this fluctuation between hope and fear, and looking upon that over which we have no control. But insofar as we turn inwards to the actual, just getting real, getting realistic, and turn inwards to the actual causes of happiness and of suffering, then we see there's nothing to wait for. There's no waiting for our spiritual practice. There's no waiting to come to the center of our being, to cultivate mindfulness, compassion, loving kindness. There's no waiting. And when it comes to the spiritual life, as we sow, so in that very instant do we reap. We don't devote ourselves to practice and meditation because we'll get some dividends later, like an investment. It's in the very sowing itself. So for all of those who have a tendency to want for immediate self-gratification, immediate gratification, I'm one of them. I want happiness now. I want freedom from suffering now. I don't want to wait, especially for things beyond my control. If you're interested in immediate gratification, turn single-pointedly inwards to your spiritual practice. And it's already there in the very taste of the practice itself. Thank you again, my dear brother.
I have nothing to add to that except my gratitude and the sense of this very dialogue being a dream come true of many decades for me, to be able to speak and listen at this kind of depth across these precious, precious traditions. And so I simply pray that we may continue in whatever mode and means and media allows in the months and years to come. So thank you so much for this opportunity.